We're gonna kick things off right now, and for this week's WTF Wednesday, um, of course, each week we do have a different business function expert. Today we're going to talk about service desk optimization, building a high performance engine for your MSP. And we all know that our service desk, our help desk, whatever you call it, um, it can appear to be very busy. Sometimes they're busy because they truly are swamped. Sometimes it's just that, we're not as efficient and as optimized as we possibly could be. And, busy does not equate to us being efficient. We all know that. I think that goes without saying. And of course, busy does not mean profitability, which is a key thing that we need to take into consideration. And being busy does not equal scalability. So service desk is not just that ticket taking machine. I think there's always that thought process that, your service desk needs to be full. I think that means that like you're doing your job, but of course there's also that proactive side of things where, if we are spending time being more proactive, hopefully the number of tickets that are going into our service desk are diminishing. And so all of this really has a huge impact on our satisfaction of our clients, um, also just the technician morale, little things that I know many years ago that we made a change of is like we had one queue for everything, and eventually we broke things up, and that one queue just became overwhelming, and that really has an impact on our techs. It also impacts, like I mentioned, profitability, our growth and scalability, and so on. So without further ado, I'm excited to bring on Chris Saltzman from Distributed IT. Chris works closely with MSPs in optimizing operations, working to build processes around multiple facets of an MSP to help scale and just turn that chaos into consistency. Um, and with that being said, Chris, welcome. How are you doing today?
Hey, thank you very much for the introduction there. I'm doing great and happy to be a part of all this. Hopefully I'm able to help you guys avoid some of the lessons that I learned myself when I was working in MSPs, the like technical director and service manager and senior engineer and all that. A lot of the comments I have today are condensing what I've learned over those 15 years into some few bullet points. Obviously, there's a lot more nuance to it than this, but can't teach somebody how to be a great surgeon in 10 minutes, but you can provide some pointers that lead to other questions, right?
Exactly.
So if you have any questions, anybody, while I'm going through the slides here, feel free to interject if it's a quick one. And if it's a longer question, of course, happy to discuss that at length after the short little deck here. So go ahead and get started. I assume everybody can see my screen here. Let me get the share going. Cool. Everybody can see that okay?
Yep. Yes.
Awesome.
Perfect.
Okay. So the first thing I want to do is just take a minute and think about where you are on this little graph here, or this little graphic. Do you consider yourselves to be fully optimized, where everything is squared away, you don't have any problems, all your clients are a culture fit, all your processes are standardized? Or on the way other end of the spectrum, are you very chaotic, where it's firefighting all the time, recurring issues all the time that keep coming back, very reactive, you're not really sure if you're profitable and all that? So just take a minute, do a gut check on this, and think about where you are. Most companies I talk to, and most of the ones I've worked in, are usually about a 2.5, I would say. Get quick poll of the group here. Where do you each think you are, if you don't mind sharing?
Definitely at managed. I'd say we're definitely at level 3.
Level three. Okay. That's awesome to hear.
Others?
I would say it's level 3,
Okay.
maybe 2.9.
2.9. Yeah.
We we are a little bit more of a mature MSP, so we are at the 4 level. Do track that those sort of things as far as documentation, standardized tech stack. Our CSAT is usually above 99%, which is a pretty
Nice.
awesome goal.
Yeah.
That is wonderful. I would say even just knowing that you have a CSAT score and measuring it is a big step to take. And a lot of MSPs do that, but a lot of them shockingly don't too, and they just have this kind of anxiety about like, I'm not sure if our clients are happy or not. I think they are, but I'm not sure. And using a CSAT tool is obviously a great way to get around that. So a lot of the things that I hear when I talk to companies, especially when we're just conversing, we're not working together yet, or if I'm just, having a conversation with somebody who's in my industry, if they're not in that 3 or 4 space, I hear things like this a lot. And if you find yourself saying these kinds of things or thinking these kind of things, then those are really good clues that you might have some of these issues that need to be addressed to, optimize your desk. But if you're honestly in that level 3 or 4 space, you've probably already passed through this and you had these kinds of anxieties, and now you're on the other side of it. On the technical side, a lot of what I see is, always in firefighting mode, where you feel like you're behind the 8 ball and on a treadmill, and various other metaphors like that, where you're not able to get ahead of the constant reactiveness to be able to actually do the M and MSP, where you're able to be proactive and start doing those, quarterly QTRs or STRs or whatever you call them. You're just constantly reacting to emergencies. And in a lot of cases, it's the same emergencies over and over, which of course is frustrating to clients and to staff at an MSP, where I have a client I talk to a lot where they're very frustrated by this because the you could call her like a director of managed services type position. She's frustrated that she's not able to focus on the more long-term proactive things because her team is constantly buried in the same basic stuff, like services crashing on servers and, why is this firewall going offline again? And that really kills a team when you can't get out of that cycle, right? A lot of slow manual work, not automating things with their RMNs. Just every time the server crashes, they go fix it. They don't get alerts. They're not having automation respond to alerts to restart services and things like that. Alert fatigue for sure is very common, where you're getting tons and tons of alerts from your tools, but somehow paradoxically you're still missing important things that you should have been able to avoid because you've got so much just spam and noise coming through that out of 50 spurious alerts, you're missing the 2 that you really needed to catch ahead of time. Definitely all of these things are ultimately tied back to bad or no documentation, where onboarding gets rushed through, or the wrong person is in the wrong seat doing onboardings and they're not documenting those clients from top to bottom, back to front, start to finish. Or even worse, where the technical team does want to do that and they do have the capability for it, but the owner doesn't see the value in it. And they're saying, no, just push through the next one. I want to sell another contract. We don't have time to do 10 hours of documentation. And then that hurts everything, for the duration of that relationship. And if you've ever said to yourself, I don't think I trust our backups, that is certainly a pink flag to be aware of. On the financial and admin side, if any of you find yourselves doing things like constantly hand correcting time because the wrong hourly rate is applied, if you have ever wondered to yourself, I wonder if this agreement is profitable, or I wonder if that client is profitable. If every client has a slightly different agreement where different things are covered or not covered, and you've got 20 clients and 15 different types of agreements rather than kind of selling the same 3 or 4 offerings to everybody, or if you have these really complicated decision trees where it's like on-site is covered unless it's the first Tuesday of the month and the angle of the sun is 37 degrees, except the first half hour is free, that kind of stuff. Unhelpful reporting for sure. If your invoicing is taking like days and it's frustrating your back office team and they don't have the time to improve their processes because they spend so much time just manually chewing through their invoicing. A very, very common one that I see all the time is the back office person will say something to me like, usually comes up conversationally. They don't come out and say it directly. I'll ask them a question about invoicing or something like that, or agreements, and they'll come back and say, well, I can't do that because I have to be able to log into our RMM and SentinelOne and this and that and count how many seats we have every month. Otherwise, the clients get mad. And I always say, well, why do you feel the need to do that? We should be automating that with API integrations, pushing that stuff to additions on your agreements. And this really is a four-letter word to me. That's the way we've always done it. The best boss I ever had this story he would tell. It wasn't, a personal anecdote, just a metaphor really, where somebody in the story walks in and it's Thanksgiving time and they're making holiday dinner and his wife is cutting the ends off of a ham. And he says, hey, why do you do that? And she goes, well, I don't know. My mom always did it, so I do it too. And he goes, well, why did your mom do it? And she goes, I don't know. Let me call my mom and ask. Mom basically says the same thing. Well, I don't know. My mother always did it. Well, let's call your grandmother and ask why. Hey, Grandma, why did you always cut the ends off the ham? And she goes, well, in 1954, the pan I had was too small, so I had to cut the ends off to fit it. And that's a silly story, but at the same time, it happens in business all the time where, especially in the finance and admin team, for some reason, there's like this silly process that happens and nobody really knows why it happens. It's super time consuming. And it's just because years and years and years and years ago, some workaround was put in place because of a bad process that shouldn't have even existed. And you'll find people asking questions about how to do the workaround rather than why are we doing the workaround, and it's an XY problem situation. Then over on the client side, the number one most common thing in, I would say, all the MSPs I've worked in with or for is the easiest stuff gets missed. And it's always new user provisioning, new PC setups, and then also offboardings of the same. The shared drive gets missed. Why don't I have the accounting printer? And then the clients will say things like, we've been working with you for 4 years. Everybody who gets hired in this department is supposed to have access to the accounting printer. Why are you still missing it? And it's always because that stuff hasn't been documented properly, both for the clients internally, and we're not automating that kind of stuff that shouldn't even really have to be thought about. Probably second most common would be the stale ticket sitting for days, where a ticket comes in and it either doesn't get responded to quickly, or it does, but it's been sitting in progress for 4 days or something like that. And that's either because there isn't a workflow to catch that, or there is a workflow to catch it, but it's like the noisy alerts problem where it happens so often that whoever is sitting in that dispatch or service manager role has 57 of those in their inbox, and there's no way for them to catch up on it. It becomes a cycle. Saying things to yourself like, I feel like we're slow. I don't think it should take this long, but it seems like it takes too long. Not being sure if the clients are actually happy, which means no CSAT. Everybody on this call, I think, has that. So that definitely doesn't apply to you guys. Preventable outages. I know when I was an engineer, the one that drove me crazy the most was domains expiring and SSL certificates expiring. I had one of my non-MSP clients go through this about 2 weeks ago. I'm not an MSP, so I don't monitor stuff like that, but he emailed me like 20 minutes before I was supposed to go out of town saying, hey, my email stopped working. I'm not sure why. We did a screen share and his domain has expired the day before. And when I was an engineer in MSPs, this was a really common one, and it's so easy to avoid by just having a monitor on that kind of stuff. The client I mentioned who is always in firefighting mode and really frustrated by it, Their second biggest anxiety here is this: does everybody have the agents they should? Meaning, the client has 50 workstations, but I only see 47 RMM agents, but there's 55 in SentinelOne and 30 in this tool, and why the heck are these all different? And ultimately, that's an automation and reporting problem. I kind of went over a lot of this in the previous conversation, but what is usually happening to cause these problems, the number one, which contributes to technical team frustration, staff frustration, finance frustration, client frustration, is excellent documentation has seen more of a, I wish we had it, it would be nice to have, but we don't have time. And that will undermine everything you're trying to do. It will make a 15-minute problem take 2 hours to respond, because you should be able to log into a firewall and reboot it. But then you go look in, IT Glue or Hoodoo or IT Boost or whatever you use, and you see 17 different passwords all called firewall and 10 called password, and you don't know which one is which, because 9 different people have done it 5 different ways. And that is super, super frustrating when it's 2 a.m. and you're trying to get something done quickly. And it's super frustrating to your clients because, it takes 2 hours to solve something that should be ultimately pretty quick. This usually comes from onboardings being rushed and or unstandardized, where there isn't an SOP process for your engineers to follow during onboardings, or if there is, they're not given the time to follow it, or you have people who are not really qualified to do it. Like, it's a common thing where we'll just send a level 1 out, we'll just have them be on site all day because it's simple, right? You're just taking pictures and documenting stuff and setting passwords, but really it requires a senior level of expertise to do that well, and to go, hey, that looks weird, let me lift the corner up and see what's going on under there, and document things properly. Also pretty common, if an MSP does not have a real MSP focused CMDB, like IT Boost or Hoodoo or IT Glue or Passportal, or even configurations in your PSA, where they're like, we'll just put it in SharePoint, it's free, just upload a bunch of Word docs in there, and then you end up with 7 different SharePoint libraries and a bunch of mess, and nobody knows what's current and what's not. On the service team, obviously most of what a help desk does is reactive, but if we're taking the service team as a whole, it's not just reactive support, it's also proactive support. And the metaphor I like to use is, it's like an emergency room plus a primary care doctor together, which you probably all know. But if all you're doing is responding to problems, you're not monitoring health and preventing future problems, which is an obvious concept, of course. But as obvious as it is, so many MSPs are missing the M part of managed services, where they're just responding to tickets, and they're not saying, well, why has this service crashed 17 times in the past 2 months? Let's go address the root cause of it, make that ticket go away. It's shockingly common. Lack of good escalation, either too much or not enough. Too much comes from usually junior technicians who are intimidated by something or just flat out lazy. Like, I remember about 10 years ago, I had a technician say to me, as close to verbatim as I can remember, it was something simple like setting up a new shared printer. He says, do you expect me to look up how to do something? Why don't you just tell me how to do it? And I was flabbergasted. I was like, 60% of our job is Googling stuff, and you're trying to escalate something because you've worked on HP but not Dell printers, and you're mad that you have to look up how to do something on a Dell. I wanted to kick him out the door that day. So when you see escalation problems, it's either some version of that, or somebody's scared by it, and so they kick it up too fast, or like a lot of us, we want that satisfaction of fixing it. Like Josh, you were talking about your calendar that gives you a little emoji when you cross something off. Especially as engineers and technicians, we want that satisfaction of being like, all right, I got it, I figured it out. And junior technicians will try to hold on to stuff for too long, when that's not fair to the clients, right? After 30, 45 minutes, if you're still chewing on it, it really needs to go to the next level. You all have CSAT which is awesome to hear, but a lot of managed services providers do not. They're not using the CSAT functionality built into their PSA or Smileback or something like that. And they can say, well, I think our clients are happy. You know, I talk to them every couple of months and they seem like they're in a good mood, but you can't prove it with data, right? And if you are monitoring CSAT, not only should you be sending the little surveys out, but you should be acting on them. If you get a negative or even a neutral review, that should always lead to a personal follow-up from an account manager or a service manager or somebody like that, where if you get a negative or a neutral review, that those specific reviews should be going to like a dedicated CSAT board or an account management board, where whoever owns that reaches out to the contact on the ticket personally and talks through the issue and then closes the loop with the technician and all that. Lack of triage, dispatch, and classification is a big one, especially appropriate use of statuses, meaning, you know, new in progress, on hold, and all that. You'll see that where a ticket comes in and it's new and it gets worked, but the status didn't get updated. So if a dispatcher goes to look at it, or if a workflow tries to look at it, it's as if it hasn't been responded to, which of course skews your report and screws up the ability to triage properly. No real reliable senior engineer. By that, I mean a person who you can implicitly trust, both professionally and technically, that they will own and drive something to completion without needing to be chased or ridden, and they don't make mistakes. Obviously, everybody makes mistakes sometimes, but if whoever is sitting in your senior engineer seat is regularly dropping the ball or letting stuff slide or making technical mistakes, doesn't matter what their title is, they're not the right person and they're not really that senior engineer. And then if you don't have anybody holding the team accountable for this stuff, doesn't matter how great your processes and workflows and automations are, if CSAT is slipping, if resolution time is slipping, and you have a conversation to talk about it, but nobody's actually being held accountable, meaning, hey, if this happens again, we're going to have a disciplinary issue, and you have, you know, an actual, you know, verbal counseling, write-up, termination type of a process where you just deal with a toxic employee for 2 years because you don't want to fire them because they're nice guys and they do okay sometimes, you know, that is definitely cancer for a team. On the invoicing side, I talked about this a bit on the previous slide, but if you find yourself doing any of these kinds of things, it doesn't have to be that way. If you've got lots of manual ticket and time entry correction, whether it's your hourly rates, you know, on-site versus remote, or this person put in 4 hours and I know they're only there for an hour, and you're regularly, constantly doing that stuff, that is not something that should be happening, of course. If you're manually counting agents in really any tool, with very rare exceptions, that either means you need an API setup or a different tool. If you're selling different types of contracts to every different client instead of the same, like 2 or 3 or maybe 4, that would be a huge cause of this kind of stuff. And then lastly, if you're, well, not really if, but I see this regularly where the PSA is overbuilt while also not doing the things that it needs to do. So you've got tons of old companies, tons of old contacts, you know, a bunch of workflows, nobody knows what they do. You've got 8 different boards for 5 people where you've got, you know, more than they need, but at the same time, it's not doing what they do need. And then lastly, very common to see the RMM is all R and not much MM, where it's just glorified team viewer. You know, you're using it to remote into computers and maybe you get a few alerts, but you're not using those alerts to automatically remediate options or problems. You're not restarting services when they crash, that kind of thing. And sadly, extremely common even in the days of Windows 10 and 11, where it's not really optional. There's no managed patching, where the workstations patch sometimes when they reboot, but there's no reporting, there's no monitoring, there's no following up on machines that failed to patch. There's no approval cycle where, you know, on patch Tuesdays, you're not looking at your patches that need to be installed and saying, do we approve this or reject it, and testing and update rings and all that stuff. What's usually happening in optimized teams, in that 3 and 4 box is the opposite of that stuff, right? Excellent client documentation is non-negotiable. Every client is onboarded completely, and it's not an option not to do it that way. And there's no, well, we'll just get the agents rolled out, and next quarter when we have time, we'll go back and fix it, because you never will. It has to be done from the beginning, or it really won't get done. At the same time, all core processes, both for the clients and for the MSP, should be standardized and scalable. If you're deploying 10 different brands of firewalls, that's not scalable. It's not really easily documentable. Standardize the stack and the documentation. On the service team side, it's reactive, proactive, but also well managed. And I don't mean in an HR sense there. I mean the managed part of managed services. You're doing CSAT, you're tracking it, you're responding to it. You have an escalation process. You have KPIs and reports that track adherence to those KPIs, and then you're acting when a KPI is consistently slipping. You have a senior engineer who you can trust implicitly, both from a professional standpoint and a technical standpoint. And this seems paradoxical, but sometimes that person just gets left alone, because when you are a senior engineer, this will be more in the next week's conversation, but you can't be a project person and an escalation person. You can't be figuring out why a switch has been crashing for the past 2 months when you need 3 or 4 hours interrupted if you're constantly being interrupted for other stuff. So sometimes those people need to be left alone to be effective. And then you have a service manager who truly holds the team and themselves accountable for CSAT and KPIs and whatnot. Not just a person who approves time off and says, okay, you can go to lunch, but a person who's really monitoring, managing, and optimizing the team. On the invoicing side, I don't know how big your companies are, but I would say in what I encounter as an average MSP, meaning like 20 to 40 clients and 10 or 15 employees, so scale up or down as appropriate. Invoicing really shouldn't be taking more than about 3 or 5 hours a month, and that's including the adjusting that does need to happen. If your back office person is taking days or 10, 15, 20 hours to do invoicing, and you're not huge with like 100 plus clients, something is wrong in that process. And lastly, your RMM is doing the R and the M and the other M, where you've got alerts tuned, you're getting the alerts you do want, you're not getting the alerts you don't want. Your alerts are doing automatic remediation of stuff like services crashing and disks running out of space and all that. And it's deploying all of your other agents. If your workstation build process is like, I'm going to go install the RMM agent with a USB stick and then go to SentinelOne and log in and download that, and go to this other tool, log in and download that. That, of course, is silly. Your RMM should be pushing all that stuff out. And last but not least, you're using your RMM to manage patching and report on patching, chasing compliance issues, and tracking your patching penetration percentage. On this last slide here, I wanted to throw up some good example KPIs. In no way do you have to use these 6 or all 6 of these, but if you're not currently tracking any KPIs and you're not sure what a good threshold should be, if you use these, you're going to be 80, 90% of the way there. First contact resolution means 1 touch per ticket in a perfect world. You don't have a ticket passing between 4 or 5 different people before it finally gets resolved. Maybe you have a couple if you need an escalation, but the first time somebody takes a ticket and looks at it and starts working on it, they're resolving it. If it has to bounce between a bunch of different people, or somebody is touching a ticket 5, 6 times, something's going on there. Either you're not escalating fast enough or something's wrong in the process. Utilization here in the lower left is one of my favorite topics to talk about, because it means different things to different people. And when I say 70 to 80% utilized, I don't mean you're able to invoice a client for 80% of that person's time. I mean, they're spending 80% of their time doing what you want them to do, which of course is mostly going to be client facing, but it might also be internal work. It might be training or professional development, but you want them to be 70, 80% utilized, meaning work for the company or for clients. I think the others here are pretty self-explanatory. Top right sees that. We all know what that means. Mean time to resolution means basically the average amount of time it takes to resolve a ticket. For all of your level 1, level 2 help desk type stuff, I would say 4 hours is high, but it happens sometimes. Escalation rate is an interesting one because you want it to be low, but also not too low. If it's too low, that means people are holding on to stuff too long, which will drag this number up, mean time to resolution. And if you're nowhere near these numbers, don't think that, holy crap, we're at 7 or like 50% first contact resolution. We got to get to 74%. It's more of an incremental thing where try to go up 5 or 10% a quarter or something like that. So that's my spiel there. I'm sure this number varies depending on where you look, but I would say it's pretty close to what I've experienced anecdotally, where almost all clients who decide to switch MSPs, it's not about cost, it's about customer service and about experience. And when I would go do potential client assessments and say, well, why are you looking to leave your current provider? I don't think I ever once heard, well, they're just too expensive. It was always, they're slow to respond. I asked about this 5 times, nobody got back to me. I submit tickets and I don't hear back for 5 days. It's always that kind of stuff. And of course, the more clients you lose, the harder it is to, have staff and capacity to deliver good service. So it becomes a cycle. So that's my spiel there. I think we're going to open it up for questions.
Yeah.
Is that right, Dan?
Great information. And let's open it up to any questions that anybody has. And actually, before we open up to questions, this might help prompt questions. Chris, give a little background about your specialty. I know ConnectWise is big. You have some Autotask experience, but if you could just give kind of where your specialty is, just so that maybe that might prompt some questions in as far as how to optimize and do things better within those applications.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to do that and a little context about all these comments too. I worked in MSPs for about 15 years as the different job titles kind of for the same role, like a technical director of managed services or service delivery, where my role was a mixture of being the senior most engineer doing project scoping, project execution, project management, managing the team, managing our internal tool set. So the PSA, RMM, AVIC, line guard, endpoint security, all that kind of stuff. On a technical background, most of my experience is in Windows Server Administration, Microsoft 365, Azure, VMware, Hyper-V, firewalls, and security. And I did that for about, like I said, 15 years. Also had some just like small business IT experience and enterprise IT experience. And in working in MSPs, I discovered what I really like doing is building MSPs. And so by way of being that like senior tool management person and building MSPs from generally the startup to maturity phase, and I would kind of move on and go to the next one, I discovered what I really like doing is building MSPs. And so I still do a lot of technical work, but most of what I do is PSA and RMM deployment or optimization. I am a ConnectWise partner, so I do deployments of new PSA and RMM and Automate and BrightGauge and Smileback and all that to new ConnectWise partners. But I also have a lot of experience with a lot of stuff in the Kaseya portfolio. So IT Glue and Bullfish and Datto and all that. They own so many things now. But a lot of RMMs, a lot of PSAs, a lot of security tools, a lot of process procedures, and technical staff augmentation too.
Awesome. So that gives you guys a little background, as far as where Chris is at. That might kind of correlate to any questions you have. Who's got the first question?
I don't have a question, but a good conversation starter. We've heard the term, and it's certainly true. Not all revenue is good revenue. So, looking at this from a service desk standpoint, when do you make that determination? To let go of bad revenue?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would say if it costs you more to deliver the work than you make from it, in edge cases aside, right? Sometimes things happen. You have a great client and a project just goes bad or something. But, if you're selling a product and it takes you 30 hours to deliver 10 hours worth of work, that's bad revenue. If you are building an engine to, produce cubes and the idea of fairy visits, and you said, well, I like this product, we're going to start selling spheres, but nobody on your team is trained how to do it. And you haven't decided to pivot your company towards being a sphere company. You just want to sell one. So I would say a good answer would be anything that's unprofitable or uh, diverges from your standard, and your team hasn't been trained up on how to deliver it and support it, and it's not really scalable. You just saw an article and you think it's cool or something like that.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that, and I think if there's a level of consistency to, the lack of profitability on an account, and through conversations, if we've exhausted everything we possibly can to ensure that, we are being proactive and, we're trying to diminish the amount of reactionary tickets, and we've done a good job at that. And also, if oh gosh, I can't think of a nice way of saying this, but if there are end users who are just over and over flunking the IQ test, putting the business at risk. And we've had conversations with our liaison and had discussions about how they can, assist them to do better, maybe put some training in place. And it just continues, the definition of insanity is, doing the same thing, expecting different results. And if we're doing that over and over and over, then I think we just need to determine, they just might not be a fit. And if they're just not listening to process and procedure, because you know just because there's a help desk there to help you, that business owner, business leader needs to look at it from perspective of, sure, they can just call in, but is that the most efficient and effective use of their time? If they're, constantly calling in and not doing their own due diligence or thinking, more smart, again, lack of a better way to say it, then, we have to take all that into consideration.
Yeah, this very good point. And there's two others I would add to that too. One is just toxic relationship clients who often tend to be the most high paying, but they make everybody unhappy. I had a client
Yeah.
once who really everybody at the MSP hated working with them, including the owner, but they paid so much that we dealt with it for a long time. And this is a true story. Of course, I won't say who this was, but the owner of this client would do things like she was in labor one time and her BlackBerry stopped working. She couldn't get emails, and she demanded that the owner of the MSP I worked for go to the hospital with a new phone and give her a new phone and set it up while she's sitting there in the maternity ward, which is about the ninth most irritating thing that person did. And most of the staff at that client were fine, but the owner was so toxic, so entitled, and so narcissistic that everybody just hated working with her. And we ended up losing that client, but nobody was sad about it. I'm sure the owner was sad that he lost the revenue, but everybody else was like, "Oh, thank goodness, I don't have to talk to that person again."
So Dan,
Toxic,
it-
toxic, narcissistic owner. I mean,
yeah,
who doesn't have one of those, right? I mean,
yeah,
Dan,
it's like,
speaking of,
Look
yeah,
inwardly, Dan. Look inward.
I was going to say, speaking of what you said before about flunking the IQ test,
yeah.
I got a new low today. All right.
Uh-oh.
Guy's trying to find the dial-in number for a Teams meeting, but in his calendar, he was just hovering over the entry and it was just giving him a little preview. So I
Yeah.
had to double click it to open it up. I'm like, there you go. Now proceeds to dial the number with me on the phone.
Oh my.
wow.
Yeah.
I'm like,
Well,
sir, you got to hang up first.
so answering the question really is difficult because I think there's so many case by case scenarios
Mm,
because we do have to face the fact that we are here for a reason and we are here to serve. We have the talent, that's why they've reached out to us and hired us and have us in place. But there is that, going back to that definition of insanity, if they're continuously burning up time to a point where, you're doing the same thing over and over and over again, you're educating, and they're just using you as a crutch, and it's affecting profitability, then you really got to take a serious look at that. I think I don't know that service desk alone would be the reason, but if you take a look at it, overall, if they're not making investments into technology, if you're having QBR, TBRs, and you're talking about replacing equipment, and they're like, oh, our stuff's fine, and we're pushing over our thresholds, those type of things. If they're not making investments into new technology, if there are new updates to maybe their line of business software and they want to stick with the old and not move forward. I'm not talking like one small change. I'm talking they're so far behind that, it's either getting to a point where it's not supported or it's not supported. I mean, those are all the things that overall we have to take into account.
yeah, good point there too. Like clients that put you at risk. You somebody gets ransomware and then you say, okay, you have to turn MFA on, which hopefully all your clients have MFA on, but a lot of them don't. And they say,
Yeah.
well, I don't want to do that. I just want to be able to sit down at my computer and check my email. I don't want to have to enter numbers. And
Well, I don't
you
want to
gotta,
have to pay my rent either, but I don't have that
Right.
choice.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Exactly.
yes, and they'll pay you, but they're putting you at so much risk because those are also the people who will immediately blame you when something happens, even though you told them exactly how to avoid that problem. I think another one would be, this is more of a project thing, but account managers who will just sell anything they
Really?
can and kick it over the wall. They don't hand things
Right.
off well. They don't vet the solutions with
There's
the
a
technical.
disconnect between, yeah, there's that disconnect between what's being sold and the reality of what you can deliver, right?
Exactly, yeah. I used to have an account manager who would do that constantly, where he would sell anything he could, kick it over the wall, and then it was the engineering team's problem to deal with. And if
Right.
the project ended up losing money, he certainly wasn't going to admit blame for that. And a person was so toxic. He was a funny story too, because as horrible as he was to deal with, and even though the clients didn't like him, we had a client there who, this is also a true story. He hated this guy so much that when he would send the client a quote with a little picture on it, like CPQ or Closel, one of those products does, he would have his assistant like white out over the dude's face so he wouldn't have to see his face, but then he would still buy the quote. So it's like somehow he was so good and so horrible at the same time that this client hated him but would still buy his solutions, and it was about the same to work with him internally. And so we made money, but it was poison pill and all of it.
Yeah. So, a question that I have is, and this can be regardless of the type of PSA, but what's one of the most common things that you see that an MSP could be more efficient when it comes to managing their help desk, whether it be their queues or just the actual tickets themselves. Because we all know that we often scratch the surface at what the full capabilities are of the tools we use. Everybody does that.
Mhm.
And how do we do better? We have the tools. How do we do better at using what we have?
Yeah, that's a big question for sure. Like, and the first thing I thought of is a really silly one, or not really a silly one, but it's a common one that is kind of silly, but it has a big effect where not keeping the contact list clean, which seems insignificant, but it causes all kinds of little inefficiencies because pretty much all PSAs do this, where when a ticket comes in, it looks for the email address in the system. It tries to match the domain to a company, and then it tries to match the part before the @ symbol to a contact. And then if it finds a match, it assigns the ticket to the correct company and the correct contact, right? But if you have a messy contact list with duplicates and one contact under a bunch of different companies, then you have somebody on your team who is probably many, many times a week changing the company on the ticket, changing the contact, fixing this, fixing that, which also breaks various workflows you have in place. And people will say, well, I don't have time to go clean up my contact list. Who cares? But
Mm.
as you grow, it causes significant inefficiencies. I think the second one would be agreements not being set up properly, where
Can I jump in real quick? One thing I want to mention on that contact list is if your PSA has the capability of tying into your Active Directory or to their Active Directory, do it. Have that integration where you're pulling in all the users from AD into your PSA as users so that you can have them efficient. So if you delete a user, then it's coming out of there. Josh, you have a hand up?
Yeah, I was gonna share what we do. So, Active Directory is one way, but we tend to do the Entra ID, so it's connected. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
we use Halo. Just switch to
Okay.
that. How it works is we also utilize SIP. Kelvin's a cyber drain tool, and when we onboard a client, they get onboarded through SIP through GDAP, and then there's standards that push out. But there's the Halo Enterprise app that automatically pushes out. Additionally, there is a dynamic group that automatically pushes out. Now, this does fall apart if a client doesn't have the licensing for dynamic groups, but most of them do. What this dynamic group is doing is it's grabbing all of the basically the employees that are licensed, that like aren't admin, that aren't service account. There's some filters. And then there is a manual review process, but for the most part, it's grabbing actual employees that would submit tickets. So that group automatically made, they're automatically synced to Halo. So any account that is synced in that isn't in that group is considered a service account. So they exist for CMDB purposes, but they can't submit tickets or anything. But then again, it's constantly updating, once a day. So if an employee gets let go, they're no longer even synced or on that. It's basically just completely automated, up-to-date contact list.
That's great. Yeah.
yeah,
And little efficiencies, make such a huge, and it doesn't take that long to set up. I mean, you know, I know when we did that at one point, I wasn't too involved with it, but I just remember it wasn't a very big process.
I can post our dynamic group, the rules in the chat, and if it helps
Yeah,
anybody, please feel free to
that's
skip.
awesome.
Let me get that for you guys here.
All right, Chris. So I jumped in
no,
as you
okay,
were
yeah,
going to number two. Yeah.
yeah, that's great stuff. And what Josh said is a great solution for doing stuff like this. And if you don't have Halo or you don't have the ability to use that middleware, there are other products out there that do it for other PSAs as well. And the dynamic group solution in particular is a great way of doing that because then you can target other stuff at that too, like the phishing simulations and portal access and guest access to your teams with Microsoft 365 external users and stuff like that, where you can leverage one small thing for a bunch of other efficiencies. And if you happen to be doing user-based billing instead of like device-based billing, you can automate your user-based billing, agreement addition counts based on the number of users in that group, right? If they hire 5 people, it's automatically going to increment the additions. And of course that varies by client, but something so small as contacts can spawn out to all these other things. Number 2 would be agreements not being set up properly. I have a client right now who has been frustrated for years that they're not able to do good P&L reporting, and they are not able to build a report that shows like actual time entered on tickets versus, the rounded up billable time for the nearest quarter hour or whatever. So I was on a call with the owner, and she said, I want a report that shows actual versus billable time. I said, okay, that's super easy. I can do that in 5 minutes. And I built a quick report in the PSA with, actual column, billable column. But then the billable column was like zeroed out. And so I went and figured out why. And their accountant is going in every month during invoicing and like writing off hundreds of time entries in the PSA. And so I said, okay, well, why are you doing that? And it's because the agreements are not set up to properly cover or uncover, remote versus on-site, or this billable rate versus that. And so to avoid invoicing the clients, instead of fixing the agreements, for years, it's been part of the accountant's process to just go write off hundreds of time entries every month, which screws up the, billable time report, which screws up the P&L and the built-in agreement recap that exists in the PSA. And so 5 years ago, a couple hours of work would have saved probably thousands of hours of time, plus clients calling and say, why are you charging me for this? I pay for that. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tasks generated by avoiding doing that years ago. And that leads to clients asking, how do we do this workaround? Not why are we needing to do this workaround? Let's fix the root cause.
Exactly. All right. We have time for, I think, probably one more question.
I was just going to make a suggestion. You just need to get Brad on here so that we know how to add to our agreements the clause that we get to vote someone off each client's island once a year.
Yeah.
We get to vote the problem off your island.
Exactly. And for Chris, for your reference, Eric's talking about Brad Gross, who's an attorney out in Miami that works with MSPs. He's a great guy. Another question or comment? Anybody?
I got to jump to another call. But
excellent. Well, I'm going to wrap. Awesome. And I'm going to wrap things up. Next week we do, Chris will be back. And next week's topic is Scope It Right or Pay the Price, Mastering Project Scoping for MSPs. If you've ever said this project wasn't supposed to take this long, and of course we've all said that, then this is what we're going to talk about. We're going to dive into smarter discovery, tighter scoping, and how to stop scope creep before it crushes your margins. And so I think that's a huge topic. Scoping out a project is never easy. It takes time, but the amount of time that we put into it saves us a lot of time and hassle after the fact. Awesome job, Chris. Thank you so much for your time. Greatly appreciate it. Everybody have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you guys all on Friday. Take care, guys.
Boys.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for inviting me. Bye.
Thanks.